Hi, I'm Meshal Malik, and you're watching Indus Special. Many stories and voices are not a part of the history we read and try to understand today. But what forces determine the narratives which are passed on from generation to generation, and those that are not recorded are erased from our collective memories? And is there a way to rewrite a more inclusive form of history? On today's show, we explore this in greater depth. Joining us today is Mr. Saeed Khan, who's a senior lecturer in Near East and Asian Studies and Global Studies at Wayne State University in Detroit. He joins us from Detroit. And Mr. Sohail Hashmi, who's a writer and a filmmaker, joining us from Delhi. And Professor Aristotle Kallis, who's a professor of modern and contemporary history at Keele University, joining us from Edinburgh. Thank you so much for joining us all, and welcome to this show. Mr. Khan, let me start off with you. Now, as I said, there are, of course, narratives which have been eliminated from history. But the world we live in today, is there a recognition that history needs to be rewritten, that it does need to become more inclusive?
Absolutely, and this is a trend that's been going on for some time now. The esteemed Indian scholar based now in the United States, Gayatri Spivak, wrote a seminal article over 40 years ago in which she asked the question, can the subaltern speak? And she was essentially talking about then how underrepresented or unrepresented voices were erased from history and how essential it is to include them. Because remember, history is a chronicle, but good history is a conversation of multiple narratives. And the need then to understand how these various narratives, not just from the so-called top to the bottom, but from the bottom up, as well as you've recognized that history is oftentimes written by the powerful, by the victors, so to speak. And in order to provide a more complete picture, especially in what some would characterize today as being a post-truth world, makes it critical for history to have its full complexion.
Right. And Spivak's essential question is one very complex. Of course, it goes to trying to understand whether we can recover archival material, which can go over and help us record a more inclusive form of history, many other things. Before we delve deeper into that, I want to jump to Mr. Hashmi and talk to him a little more about the narratives we study today, especially when we talk about global history. Are there power structures that are more evident and reflective in those histories that we're studying?
You know, the note you had sent me, you had said, that, is it possible to have a more neutral position and so on and so forth. Now, I think that all history has a bias, because history is not simply the narration of events, but it is more to do with how you study those interpretations, those events. And there are histories, and quite a lot of the history that has been written was as the professor said just now, that much of this has been written by those who are in power. So those histories are written to ensure that they remain in power. They build narratives which serve the interest of the powerful. Right. And there is, but this division between the history with a large, broad sweep and the history from the ground up, the subaltern history. I think that this division is not, this is not the division that we should be actually looking at. We should be looking at more what is the thrust of history broadly. And you will see that history that stands with and talks of the lives of the people and how the lives changed over time, etc., is a kind of history that it is biased. It is going to place the people in the center, as opposed to kings being placed in the center. So I am more interested in this kind of history and not, trying to be neutral, because I don't think you can be neutral. You have to take a position. The question is, are you taking a position in support of the larger interest of the people, or are you taking a position in the interest of those in power?
Mr. Hashmi, just trying to expand your point a little. When you're saying the person should be put at the center, what exactly do you mean by that?
Well, if you take you take the subcontinent and you see the history that was written for a long time, we were told that there was a Hindu period, there was a Muslim period, and there was a British period. Now, the trouble begins in this classification. What is described as the Hindu period had a large population who were not followers of Hinduism. Hinduism was a category created fairly recently. The entire period dubbed as Muslim period, Muslims were in power, but was Sharia in place? Was the country being run according to Sharia? No, it wasn't. Right. The British period was called the British period. Why wasn't it called the Christian period? Because the earlier two were supposed to be a period where Muslims or Christians were in power and Hindus were in power. So when it came to the British, those who were in power were Christians. The idea of presenting British period, the period of our colonization, as a secular state, as opposed to the earlier state, brings in the very clear bias of how you're going to describe the entire history.
Right. I take your point there, Mr. Hashmi, and we're going to talk about this in greater depth. But before that, I'd like to jump to Professor Kallis and talk to him about all of this. Professor Kallis, I'd like to give this example to try to describe what we're trying to essentially get at today. Now, there's, of course, when we're talking about a gendered lens through which rewriting history is talked about, there is this term being coined and greatly being talked about, which is her story, looking at history through a more feminist lens. But the way that history has been recorded, the way that testimonies have been recorded, the way that material has been gathered, is it possible now to actually put in that feminist perspective? What does it mean to actually do that? I mean, is it possible to essentially rewrite history in that manner?
You make a very good example. You use a very good example among many. And in relation to what we were saying earlier on and what my other colleagues said earlier on, it is about restoring voices. That's what new approaches to history are trying to do. So with regard to women, which is arguably the largest silenced group, if you like, in dominant forms of history, we have been seeing obviously a lot of change. Now, historians are not necessarily methodological innovators. Giving voice back to women has started more in other disciplines, and history came to the fray, as it were, later. So we had movements earlier in cultural studies, in anthropology, and so on and so forth. Is it possible? On a practical level, of course, it's possible, and it's a much needed corrective to the narratives that we have formed. Is it possible to provide an unbiased view with regard to the role of women in history, to the contribution of women in history, to the way in which history can be understood from a women perspective? I think to an extent it is. You mentioned something at the very beginning of the program. How do we capture that voice? Okay, we may have the best intentions to do so, but how do we capture all that voice, given that history is based on material fragments from the past that have been filtered through? You know, we don't store everything. We make choices. Most choices reflect hegemonic attitudes. So what is worthy of being kept, what is not worthy of being kept, and so on and so forth. So even if in an ideal world, and I'm not saying that my profession is doing this right now, but let's say that even if in an ideal world, a reconstitution, a retelling of history from women's perspective, as long as from any other perspective, from the subaltern and so on and so forth in the broader sense, even if that intention existed to find the material, to give the material that choice, and to reconstruct an equivalent story to the hegemonic story, male-dominated, West-dominated, Christian-dominated, if you like, and so on and so forth, is actually very, very difficult. That does not mean that the enterprise of writing such a history is not important. It's absolutely necessary. It's absolutely important. And at the end of the day, our tasks as historians is not to provide the ultimate version of the past. I think we have disabused ourselves as historians from that kind of fallacy. History is not about providing the truth, because that truth, in my opinion, doesn't exist, because it changes, because it shifts. It's about dialogue, and it's about restoring pluralism, plural voices, plural perspective, plural understandings in what we're doing.
Right. Prof, now, I've been hearing a lot of this word being used by you and by the other panelists, the word restoring, and Professor Kallis just used this as well. Now, restoring would also mean that that voice existed, but it was not recorded, or it was distorted, or it was taken away, but now you're restoring it. That process would essentially mean that there's a medium for that voice to be restored. Isn't it true that sometimes the language or the mediums just don't exist for those voices, especially when we talk about the subaltern? We just haven't come up with a voice or a language in which that pain or in which those stories can be told.
And that's something that historians contend with every single day. And I'm glad that you bring this point, that part of what historians find themselves doing is contending with vocabulary and terminology. And it's not just simply for a budding junior scholar to make his or her mark at the latest academic conference by coming up with the latest buzzword. But these are imprecisions that are dealing with spatial and temporal distance. I mean, we are looking at, with our own lenses and the biases that those bring in the 21st century, wherever we're living, whether it's India in the case of Professor Hashmi, Scotland in the case of Professor Kallis, or myself here in the United States, having to disabuse ourselves of the idea that what was happening at a particular place in time in a particular space is quite different. And we, of course, then have to work with whatever we have. And sometimes that might be fairly sparse.
Right. Professor Hashmi, Mr. Hashmi, as we're talking about all of this, now, one thing that does come to my mind is the process of colonization, what happened during that time and how that changed history. How do you see that? And do you feel like the decolonization process is continuously allowing voices to be restored? How do you take from that?
The point that you're making, however, is I agree with Professor Khan and Professor Sato totally, that what history needs to do is to become more pluralistic, to have all the voices that have been kept out for centuries of history writing. For example, there is a way the tribal looks at his existence. But those who wanted to develop them, and the colonies, which were the large sweep of land that was colonized, the imperialists wanted to develop us. When development, they meant very clearly what they wanted us to do. Now, they have gone. Large part of the world, they have gone. The time of colonialism is over. Now there is neocolonialism, and people are being subjugated, nations are being subjugated through other means. The mind of a large number of people are still colonized. So you look at the world from the spectacles that have been given to you. And it is this that will have to be removed. And this can and will be removed through giving space for other voices. I don't think there can be a history that will have all these voices together. All these voices have to coexist. The bias inbuilt in history writing, which kept the women out, can't be removed by having a narrative which has only the narrative of the women. We have to have, eventually, the narrative has to include all the voices. And I think that is what is needed if you want to remove the biases that exist in the history that has come down to us. And this can only be done in an inclusive way.
Professor Kallis, now we're talking about history more inclusive, and we're talking about an ideal state in which we bring in the subaltern into the conversation, we bring in more women into the conversation. But is it just that? Is this just idealistic of us to talk about? Or is there practical measures being taken in order to move towards that direction?
Of course, it's idealistic in the sense that it's a very, very hard task. And again, you use the example of women. This is one of the most difficult fields in which that kind of restoring the voice and putting that voice, those voices, not a voice even, in the kind of big tapestry of the forces of the past that have created what we call history, is one among many of those tasks. And there are a lot of other, if you like, impediments to that process with regard to other groups and so on and so forth. But of course, every task that is idealistic does not mean that this task is not worth pursuing in so many ways. And there are indeed a lot of practical steps that have already been taken. You can divide them into a number of categories. For example, there have been huge methodological advances in the way in which we understand history, in the way in which we perform history, in the way in which we write that kind of history, the awareness of a broader context, the awareness of a plurality of views, and so on and so forth. There are a lot of practical insights that we have gained as historians from other disciplines. So if you look at history in the 19th century, for example, there was a much more literalist approach to how the past had been passed on to us. So we took a document, we took a source, we used to analyze it, but we would stick within the parameters of that source. Now we have huge important developments from, for example, linguistics, which give us far more nuanced tools with which to dissect the language, for example, that is being used in the document, to interrogate the document itself. And this is incidentally a very, very good corrective to the fact that voices of the subaltern groups have been edited out of the official record, if you like. So yes, we have an objective problem. The hegemonic view of history is supported by far more empirical information that has been left behind. We can never really restore this kind of imbalance. But if we are far more critical of the sources that we are using, if we have the tools to take them apart, to ask questions that go beyond the intention of the person who wrote the document, for example, then we are taking a huge practical step in that direction. The other thing that I would say, and it's a point again with regard to your question and a more general point with regard to what we are discussing today, is the question of bias. And as we all, and I think we all agree, you have managed to find three historians who agree, which is quite an achievement, I have to say. There is bias, and that bias is very difficult to escape. Even if we're trying to escape the bias of the past, we are reflecting biases, whether personal or cultural or whatever. There is something that is very, very important that we need to keep in mind in that respect, and that's a practical step towards restoring that balance. And that is that history even today is reproducing other biases, such as, for example, national history, such as, for example, history of regions and geographies and everything. And these are biases that are still there.
Professor Kallis, on that point, since we're running short, and that's an important point to make, and I just want to get Mr. Khan's thoughts on that. Mr. Khan, what are your thoughts on the points that Professor Kallis puts forth?
He's absolutely right. I couldn't agree more. And this idea that history is being weaponized, and particularly through the lens of nationalism. Now, this isn't new, but we also have to contend with the fact that thanks to technology and communications, these kinds of things have a reach like at no other time in history. And how this is then being used, manipulated in order to exploit populations is something that we have to then consider moving forward. And the idea that history is becoming essentialized, it is becoming reduced in this rather reductive manner to almost sound bites. One of the issues is creating binaries of this history, and the dangers then of putting everything into a value judgment of good versus bad, right versus wrong. History is far more complicated, and the task of the historian is to always inject and amplify the nuances and the subtleties when it comes to the fissures which oftentimes then leave entire groups of people out of the narratives and then distort it into a direction which unfortunately then is used in order to create even worse history when it comes to violence and when it comes to the discrimination and persecution of peoples.
Right. We're going to have to end this segment on that. Thank you so much, Mr. Saeed Khan, for joining us from Detroit, Sohail Hashmi for joining us from Delhi, and Professor Aristotle Kallis for joining us from Edinburgh. We're going to go for a short break. When we return, we're going to have another story for you. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show. Now, the debate regarding migration and refugees is one of the most complex debates of our times. On today's show, we unpack under what laws and circumstances should and must countries provide political asylum to individuals. Joining us for this discussion today is Mr. Adam Khaze, the Director of Home Migration Services, joining us from Sydney. Thank you for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Khaze, as I stated, now migration and giving a refuge to those who are seeking asylum is one of the most hotly debated political topics. But in this, there is something to also be talked about when it's specifically being focused on political asylum, especially given to criminals in one country to the other. What does international law say about this?
The international law, the international law for refugees is all governed by the UN Convention. So the UN Convention is a convention that was founded in 1951 to adjust 1967 to apply to all countries, that basically summarizes in a nutshell in what circumstances and when a refugee is defined. For political asylum specifically, that's outlined within the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So basically, to apply that to Australian law, that's within the Migration Act, and every country around the world, such as the United Kingdom and the US, would also have incorporated that within their own legislation. So it's quite broad. I'm an Australian specialist, so in the Australian context, it's quite broad, and it covers not only those who have a political opinion or involved in politics, but anyone who it may indirectly be found to may have a political opinion. And therefore is persecuted based on such. So that could be anything from attending a protest to having a T-shirt with a banner on it, or being a member of a political party. So it's quite broad.
Right. Mr. Khaze, now you state for us how it is interpreted in the Australian context. I also have with us Ms. Ieva Miluna, who's an international lawyer, joining us from Lativa. Ms. Miluna, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to the show. Now, as we're talking about the specific conditions of international law which allow political asylum, Mr. Khaze gave us a brief overview of how it's interpreted within Australian law. Could you tell us more about how it varies from place to place and what basic international law says about it?
Basically regulates it in the UN Convention on the Refugees, which is a convention of 1951. And it says that a refugee is the one who has a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of particular social and political opinion. And basically, of course, primarily the refugees who are coming from Iraq and Syria to Europe, they do not perhaps expressly have their political opinion, but perhaps they are also having the fear of such of such persecution. So the key word in international law is persecution and the fear of persecution. European Union law is having more humanitarian law guarantees, and in a way makes international law requirements even more of a humanitarian law nature. For example, there is a possibility that a subsidiary protection can be provided if there is a crime against peace, crimes and crimes against humanity. But of course, we have to differentiate what is the character of the refugees and for what particular reasons they are coming and to Europe and elsewhere in the world.
When you're saying that we need to differentiate the character of the refugees, what does that exactly mean? Because of what reason they're fleeing their homeland?
Basically, yes, this is the reason why they are leaving their homeland, and also what is their intent, because it is not a secret that European Union has heated debates about, for example, the possible terrorists of ISIS that may arrive in Europe. That is in contrary to for example, to the political refugees who are coming from Syria, who are being persecuted by the Assad regime due to their political opinions. And in Europe, of course, we are ready with the human rights guarantees, so to say, that of course we admit all refugees, but there is certain fear due to the terrorist events in Europe that possible terrorists may come to Europe as well.
Right. Mr. Khaze, as we have discussed, asylum is a basic human rights according to the United Nations Human Rights Declaration. But as Ms. Miluna also stated, that countries take into account the intent. Now, how has intent complicated the process of migration and seeking asylum?
Yeah, that's where it gets it broadens it up, because a lot of the Refugee Convention in cases has allowed for situations where someone, as long as their intention is genuine, so let's say they have a genuine intention to be involved in a political progress or feel that threat, that alone is enough to make a refugee claim in Australia. Where there are issues is where there's other intentions. So, for example, someone may use an anchor from a refugee claim when there's other intentions that are not necessarily outlined. They could be involved in criminal activities. They could be using Australia as their own anchor to further then portray or present political opinions in Australia in a safe haven. So it's all about really the intention that the person who intends to apply for a refugee visa has, whether that is genuine or not. And a lot of the debate in the courts and at the High Court level is whether the applicant in question is a genuine refugee and whether their intention is to reside and seek safety in Australia. And that's where you have issues with regards to credibility, especially with the boat crisis, where you had a lot of boat people come to Australia, especially from Iran and Iraq, claiming political asylum based on a lot of the protests and political unrest in that region.
Right. Now, as we're seeing, there is more unrest and more people trying to seek asylum, but at the same time, there is more stringent regulations being put on migration. Now, what is the political rhetoric that is being carried out within these countries that is creating more stringent regulations?
For example, in Australia, that was the biggest issue, where the argument a lot from the UN and from activists who believe that Australia has breached its obligations is that political influence has been, especially around Muslim migration, and a lot of these people come from Islamic countries, has adjusted the migration rate to possibly escape their obligations. And a lot of that has to do with their refoulement obligations, as well as how they assess and what happens to these applicants while they are being assessed. Where, for example, when someone arrives by boat from 2013 onwards, they are being processed in offshore facilities, and in many cases, it may take years before their cases are assessed. And if found that they do meet the requirements, by the time they get to Australian shores, they've suffered severe mental illnesses or have had subsequent claims due to their treatment while being processed. So it's a tough sword from both sides. There's an issue because also on the other side, you've got situations where Australia is trying to protect its borders from terrorists. And because there's a lot of the time very little evidence, because a lot of the evidence is destroyed, it's very difficult for the government to be able to filter these cases and categorise which ones are genuine applicants and which ones may be taking advantage of the system and may not have any claims whatsoever, but just a frank economic refugees, which is something that the United States government, I believe, has also claimed with a lot of the people coming over them.
So, Ieva, as we're hearing about this, seeking asylum processing requests is a very complicated process, especially for the government, and that, of course, fuels into the political rhetoric. But what laws does a government break, does a country break when they deny an individual asylum?
When they deny an individual asylum, basically, they do not break any laws. They need to observe the basic international and national law policies and requirements. Of course, there have been, as far as I know from Europe experience, from Poland and Hungary, that there have been protests against international asylum. So because there may be a fear in the society that the migrants will not integrate in the society, and it largely depends on the national legislators whether they implement these fear in the national laws or not. But the international laws are in place, and in principle, any country which are part of the Refugee Convention and its additional protocol should grant a refugee status to the person who is seeking asylum. Of course, there may be cases when asylum could be refused if there is no fear of being persecuted shown by the applicant, or, for example, there are vivid examples that a person is willing and able to engage into the terrorist activities, as the Europe has faced.
Right. Mr. Khaze, just a last question to you. Now, as you were saying that when there is intent and it shows that a person is fleeing persecution, that becomes, and it's easy for it to be proven, a country does allow for them to seek asylum there. But for instance, if a person has criminal charges placed against them and then they're trying to seek asylum within a country, how does that process become more complicated? And how could that happen, for instance, in the case of Australia?
Okay, yeah, that's probably the most difficult question. The criminal, they're under the character provisions under Section 501 of the Migration Act. Basically, the government can refuse or cancel a visa if the applicant in question has 12 or more months prison or has a record. It's quite grey where they're not a person of good character and they may promote violence or domestic violence or violence against Australia, or they may perceive to do such. Now, the part that gets complicated is in many cases, especially high-profile political prisoners, you're going to get a lot of people who have been imprisoned. For example, even for religious persecution, you've got cases in Iran where the Baha'i community, who are a minority, some of them are in prison for 10 years. So if you take it on face value, they've committed a lot of crimes. But then if you break down what crimes they've committed, basically it's because of their religious group and their beliefs of spreading their religion within a faith, which is something that's encouraged in Australia. So the context of something that would be punishable in Australia, and it has to be against the public interest. It's not just a matter of one country who's the perpetrator imprisoning or punishing someone. And I believe you've got very similar cases throughout the subcontinent of people being imprisoned or facing possible death penalty because of a religious belief or saying something that may be considered against the religion of that country. So, on face value, look, if you do get someone who's involved in terrorism and it's black and white, they could have their visa cancelled and they will be put in a detention centre and can be deported. And I believe the biggest issue now, or a lot of issues I face when I see clients, is members of the Muslim Brotherhood, who Australia still hasn't recognised the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organisation, and therefore you have many people from Egypt who have possible radical views who claim asylum in Australia and may then, and Australia cannot technically cancel the visa or refuse the visa, but they do make the process quite difficult of reaching political asylum through the character provisions.
Right. On that point, thank you so much, Mr. Adam, for joining us from Sydney. Ms. Miluna, as Mr. Khaze stated out, certain things are black and white. And in other cases, when an offense is punishable in one country, it might not be punishable in another country. But is there a basic legal architecture which states what is black and white, what is not black and white, which are the gray areas, especially when we're talking about criminal offenses and seeking asylum?
Well, the European continent is mostly based on the human rights values and humanitarian guarantees guaranteed to refugees. But of course, when a person is engaged in terrorism, then or other criminal offenses, then of course criminal law comes into play, and it's rather serious. But the European courts, and especially the European Court of Human Rights, has developed a very vivid case law in the cases of Saadi, Soring, Chahal cases, when there had been possible deportations of refugees to their home countries. And one of the main rules is the non-refoulement principle, that if there is a danger to the life and freedom of the person, even if the person is, for example, the accused terrorist, as when in one of the Italian cases has shown, then the country still cannot deport the person to his home country. This is largely based, as we saw, on the humanitarian guarantees and human rights values in the European continent that comes from the human rights conventions in Europe.
Right. On that point, I'd also like to introduce Dr. Nina Markovic, who is a political scientist, and she is a visiting fellow at the Center for European Studies at the Australian National University. She's joining us from Sydney. Thank you so much, Dr. Nina, for joining us. Now, Dr. Nina, as we were talking, that in one country, there might be a person who is charged with criminal offenses, but they might be able to seek political asylum in another country in which that country does not consider that a criminal offense. But how does that impact the wider diplomatic relations between those two countries, and what examples do we have in front of us?
Obviously, it can affect the relationship negatively, but that's why European countries have now a so-called Dublin system and a common European asylum system. Now, in theory, it works better than in practice. It also assigns member states in which the application is made to process that particular claim entirely. So the whole point of this European common asylum system is to stop the doubling up process, and precisely to stop the person going from one country to another within the broader European Union area. So it's European Union plus 4 other countries. Now, another complication arises. You also have transit countries, and we're talking about this now famous Balkan route. So the Balkan route refers to the countries which are not members of the European Union, but the refugees and asylum seekers have entered from a European Union country. So they have entered from Greece, which is an EU member, into a non-EU member, which is mostly Macedonia, now called North Macedonia, Serbia, or Bosnia. And then from there, they go on to a member of the EU, which is Croatia, most likely. Now, these countries also have the right and now obligation to process many of the applications. But again, these applicants have come from an EU country, so they don't lodge their applications in Greece. They want to go most likely to Germany and France, which are the countries with the highest number of applications within the EU area. A lot of EU countries have actually signed agreements with these non-EU countries in the Balkans to return some of the applicants and to actually process them there, which of course raises the question of what happens with these people in limbo. What happens to those who are shot trying to cross the border into Croatia or into those non-EU countries? And there are a lot of issues arising from that area, and often this is a forgotten part of a debate. And we are talking about, at one point, 6,000 people per day crossing in this region, and many of them being stuck. That is an unresolved dilemma. There is also another problem. which you have, which is the actual wall. Now we're talking about, we are living in 30 years after the fall of Berlin Wall time, but there is a wall in Europe being constructed, and it's there between Hungary and Serbia, and EU and a non-EU member again. So it's quite symbolic as well as a reality. So there is a massive steel, so it's called Smart Wall. It has smart technology. It was very costly, and this wall is designed to prevent physically asylum seekers and refugees from coming into the EU through that sort of Hungarian route.
Dr. Niaz, we're running short on time. I do want to move the conversation towards a more general outlook. I want to talk about, how do you see the narrative regarding migration and asylum seekers changing in the past year now? Ever since the refugee crisis, we have seen all across the world right-wing governments cashing in on that very issue, gaining political mileage, coming into power based on that very issue. Have you seen any major changes in the past year?
Of course, I mean, precisely as you mentioned, right-wing governments all across Europe and other countries, but we're talking about Europe in this context, have risen up. The latest European parliamentary elections also reflect the trend. If you look at pro-Brexiters during their campaign for Brexit to leave the European Union, they actually had photos of alleged Turkish asylum seekers, applicants, and migrants coming into the UK, and the posters were actually saying, if you vote for Brexit, you will prevent them from coming here. I mean, obviously a lot of propaganda, sort of negative stories coming out against the migrants and asylum seekers. There is also violence, which we can read about. It's not in the mainstream media usually, but in a lot of regional press in Europe, about violence being perpetrated against asylum seekers by new and old right-wing groups. We're talking about social movements, some of them well established, such as some neo-Nazi movements, which are quite well followed as well by security agencies in Europe, but also new groups which are, again, at the regional and local level. So when we talk about politics, we should never forget those other levels of politics where that right-wing extremism is possibly even more dangerous.
And Dr. Nina, just a last question. Looking forward, now we're also seeing a pushback against Islamophobia, against xenophobia. There was a huge march in France. We are seeing a realization against these issues. In many parts of the world, social movements coming out in greater power. Do you see in the near future that this narrative, that this rhetoric will take a turn, or do you feel like the momentum that has continued in the past couple of years will gain more strength?
Certainly you have action and reaction, but what we are missing perhaps is more effort being put on peace-building efforts and peace-building initiatives. The three countries from which asylum seekers come in greatest numbers are Syria, Afghanistan, and South Sudan. Therefore, we need more initiatives, not just led by governments, but also civil society and other social movements, churches, religious movements as well, to actually emphasize these peace-building initiatives, how to cross bridges between those who are perhaps also against asylum seekers and asylum seekers themselves, how to integrate them within the broader society and have a genuine conversation. One interesting initiative in those transit countries, which I was mentioning, the non-EU countries, is the full inclusion of many of these applicants into the education system. Now, that is a model which can be emulated in other, especially wealthier EU members. Even though they don't have a resolved status, many of those children and young adults need to be educated, need to learn languages of the countries in which they find themselves, because hopefully they will be looking for employment there in the future. Therefore, in my opinion, education is the key, as is civic engagement in peace-building initiatives.
Right. On that point, thank you so much, Dr. Nina Markovic, for joining us from Sydney, and Ieva Miluna for joining us from Litviva. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again next time with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.